Hello and welcome to episode 90 of the Rollo and Slappy Show. Today is March 7th, 2018. I am Rollo McFlugel, and with me is Slappy Jones 2, and we are both at McFlugel.com. The show notes page for this episode is McFlugel.com/90, where you'll be able to find links to the things we talk about, and also to check out our sponsor, LibertyMugs.com, where a little birdie told me that there might be a tractor mug coming up there soon, so be sure to check that out. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Slappy, and he's going to introduce our topic and our guest.
All right, thanks, Rollo. Welcome, everyone, to the Rollo and Slappy Show. I'm Slappy Jones 2, and today we have a guest to talk about Bitcoin. JW Weatherman, we can only assume he'll be teaching us a lesson. He's a software security expert, lead contributor to MathBot.com, author of Bitcoin Threat Model. You can find him on Twitter at WeathermanIM. Welcome to the show, JW Weatherman.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah, cool. We're excited for this. I think we actually will learn a lesson. We'll learn a lot from this. So if you could, 2017 was a huge year for Bitcoin. The price this time a year ago was about $1,500 or so. We saw it go all the way up to almost 20,000 in that range, and then back down a little bit. We had some forks. We had some SegWit 2x talk. We had some SegWit. Could you kind of walk us through the lead up to the Bitcoin Cash fork and what the debate was going on there, and what happened, what Bitcoin Cash is, what Bitcoin is, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So, full disclosure, I got involved in Bitcoin pretty late for most people that are kind of software security experts in the space. I really had other projects going on and just a lot of other stuff, and I didn't give it the time that it deserved until 6-8 months ago, something along those lines. But I have spent a lot of time since then. The way that I got into it actually is I'd known of some work that Dan Kaminsky had done on doing some security analysis of Bitcoin way in the early days, and I kind of discarded it. But then I had just more and more people that I knew that I respected that were interested in it, and that was kind of the social signal that I should put some time into it. And so I did the Bitcoin Threat Model, and the Bitcoin Threat Model is something that I've done professionally in my career, is doing a systematic security analysis of software. So I did that for Bitcoin and realized I couldn't really find a way to break it, and realized that it was actually incredible. And so a lot of the history in 2017, I have the benefit actually of hindsight, because I've gone back and tried to figure out, the history. I didn't necessarily live it the way a lot of people did. But I think that's actually helpful, because I didn't have to go through the emotional ups and downs that, like Eric Lombroso had to go through when he's looking back on it. It's a little simpler for me.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. You kind of get a cold eye look at everything.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So the way that I would describe everything leading up to kind of the break with Bitcoin Cash, is that way back to like Bitcoin Unlimited and Bitcoin XT days, there was a concerted effort to try to introduce a security vulnerability. And I can say that because partly because I'm emotionally disconnected, right? Like I don't have friendships. I didn't hang out with like Gavin Andreessen. So I can say that he was trying to introduce a security vulnerability, and there's no baggage there. And it's pretty simple. And the reason that I would say that is, as I did the threat model, there were a few really critical, and again, I'm doing this before I have any dog in the fight. I don't even necessarily believe in Bitcoin when I'm trying to do this systematic analysis. There's a few critical security parameters in Bitcoin, and one of them is the block size. And it's one of the few that you could sort of justify as what happens a lot in software is somebody will try to justify a security vulnerability by enabling a feature. And there's not a whole lot of those spots in Bitcoin where you could say, well, if we screw with this parameter, we're going to get something out of it. And yeah, it's a security compromise, but it's worth it. But the block size is definitely one of those. So when I look back and see what the guys in Bitcoin Unlimited and Bitcoin XT were doing, it's clear to me that they were trying to insert a security vulnerability, a design level flaw into this piece of code that was already running and functional. And so for me, the SegWit 2X stuff and ultimately Bitcoin Cash is a very nice sort of cohesive culmination of that effort that goes all the way back to, I don't know when that started, maybe 2012. It was really early.
So what would the motivation be behind adding a vulnerability?
Well, I know that's a good question. And that's where I have to say, like, I don't have like a crystal ball, right? Like when I'm looking at not just Bitcoin Cash, but other scams in the space, I can say that they're scams, right? I can say that, look, this thing from a technical standpoint is not viable, but it's being sold to people as if it is. And the people that are doing it based on the back and forth, they obviously know that it's crap, right? Like if somebody's trying to sell your grandma siding and, it's plastic siding that's not going to last more than 5 years. And you can tell by the back and forth, they know that they're full of crap. You could say, I don't know for sure absolutely what is in their heart, but I can tell you that they're selling a scam, right? So I can't tell you exactly what the motivation was. And you could go from everything from, it's a state sponsored thing to something simpler, like these guys had a business model. And this is where I tend to go with some of the stuff, although it is very cohesive. So I can pretty easily be swayed either way. But I would tend to think that, let's look at Coinbase, for example. Their participation in SegWit 2X is very logical, because if SegWit got enabled and Lightning came online, their whole business model doesn't make sense, right? They're immediately disintermediated, because one of the most important things that they can offer is very cheap transactions between customers on their platform. They're not secure. There's a whole lot of liability that goes along with that, right? Like the Mt. Gox thing, all of that. Mm-hmm. But that really is a big part of what they could offer, right? You could for free send money from one Coinbase customer to another. And I think for me, when I was trying to figure out Coinbase's motivation in particular, I went back and looked at the talk that the Lightning guys gave at Coinbase and the questions that the CEO was asking them. And if you listen to that Q&A, it's really interesting, because I think that he's seeing what's happening. He's seeing that, these payments are going to be able to be cheap, easy, fast, and there's not going to be any brand name recognition, right? And he's asking questions like, well, what's to stop somebody from setting up like a master node, right? Or a super hub, as if he's concerned about that being a possibility. But at the time, he is that super hub, right? That's exactly his business model. And so I think what he's realizing in that Q&A, and you can see it live, which is interesting, is he's realizing that his business model is dying, right? It's dead. He needs to either pivot or do something, because people, like when they use Lightning, they don't even know who they're using as for hubs, and they don't have to know, because the hubs don't matter at all, right? Like there's an issue right now where people are saying, well, we really should put a stronger ID on the Lightning hubs, or on the Lightning channels, right, or whatever, so that you know who you're routing through. And there's probably some good security reason to do that. But the reason that it isn't like super urgent is it doesn't freaking matter, because you don't really care who these people are. You care what fees they charge. Your software automatically takes care of that routing for you. And they can't steal any of your money. So who cares who they are? And if you're Coinbase and you've invested a huge amount of money into your brand name, that's not a kind of competitive playing field that you're looking forward to. So I tend to think that sort of just selfish market, sort of, the invisible hand of corruption is responsible for most of it.
Yeah, I mean, they were way late in implementing SegWit, and I think that if that was kind of a smoking gun for a lot of the Bitcoin transactions,
right? If
I remember correctly. So
yeah, they were. I mean, they have done some really goofy stuff ever since SegWit 2X. So the really dragging their feet with SegWit, really dragging their feet with enabling anything Lightning related. If they were going to say, okay, well, Lightning's coming, we're going to get ahead of it, you'd expect them to have, for a company of that size, it's $1 billion valuation plus, you'd expect them to have 2 or 3 devs working on the project. I'm not sure that they have that now, but they certainly didn't have it, 6 months ago. When it was obvious to every technical person around that SegWit was in, it was working, and Lightning was coming, and it was a good design, and it was going to be functional. So I think that, combined with some of the crazy stuff that they've said about different altcoins, right, like Ethereum, I think Brian Armstrong has said that he sold all of his Bitcoin and went in all in on Ethereum. That's pretty shady for a technical person that's just looking at like the capabilities of Ethereum versus their marketing stuff. It just doesn't add up at all. So when he says that, it's like, whoa, what's that about? And then the listing Bitcoin Cash the way they did and all that insider trading stuff. I think they've done something that has been surprisingly shady to me just about every week for the last 6 months. So I don't know what these guys are up to.
Yeah, they really lost a lot of my trust over, the course of a lot of events. I do want to get back to talking about Lightning Network, but kind of let's take a step before that and talk about the block sizes a little bit and talk about why just increasing the block size, at least right now, isn't what a lot of people might not consider to be the best strategy, and what problems there are with increasing the block size.
Right, because on the surface, like a lay guy like me who's not very technical, if you say to me, well, the network's really slow and there's high fees, let's increase the block size. That'll allow more transactions per block and lower the fees. That sounds like a good idea at first.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, it on the surface, it definitely would be a good solution. It just has side effects, right? So if you increase the block size, obviously we can do more transactions per second. But when you're talking about a system like Bitcoin, right, you're talking about something that has to scale like exponentially. So like if what I always say to people is like, just imagine being in a boardroom in like the early days of Facebook and somebody comes in and says, hey, I've got this new innovation. We're not exactly sure. There's some security risk, but hold on to your hats. It's going to double the number of users we can support. They would just be laughed out of the room, right? I mean, these guys they're scaling up exponentially, right? It's a viral sort of growth.
Right.
And that's what we have with Bitcoin. So the problem with any sort of solution to scaling is that it has to be viable for not just like adding twice as many users. It has to be viable for adding 2,000 as many users. And so if you look at something like increasing the block size, it was at 1 megabyte. SegWit did increase the block size, and actually, I wasn't involved, right? So I can't complain too much about the guys that fought the fight when I wasn't even involved. But if there's one thing that I would say was kind of an error that Bitcoin has made over the last year, it was that SegWit did include a block size increase. Now, obviously, it's been okay. It hasn't been a big problem, but when you increase the block size, you are increasing the amount of latency between all of the different nodes on the network and all of the different miners. And there's no way around that, right? There's a certain amount of inverse relationship between how much data that you have to send across the internet and how fast you can send it, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you increase the amount of data you have to send within, a short period of time, you're increasing the time, and as you increase the time, the miners that hear about the block that was mined most recently first are going to have an advantage. So to be really simple, let's say you have 2 miners in your house, and one miner finds a block and it broadcasts it out to the network. The other miner that's in your house is going to hear that first, right? Or very, very quickly. And a miner in, Indonesia is going to hear that later, right? Even if it was just the speed of light, there's going to be a time delay there. And that time delay isn't too big of a deal if it's small, but it still matters. And the reason that it matters is that your miner in your house now has a head start on the next block. So it's going to be able to guess more times than the other guys are going to be able to guess. And that increases the chances that you find the next block. Now, if that if that advantage is super small, it doesn't really matter. It kind of ends up out in the wash. And other miners are going to, the guy in Indonesia eventually is going to find a block. And so the other miner in your house is going to be delayed. It doesn't matter. But if you increase the block size to say 100 megabytes, that would be certainly that would be a significant enough delay to where the miners that are close to the last found block would have an advantage. And what that would mean is that the miners knowing this and being smart business people would have a tendency to start concentrating the mining equipment even more than it is, right? And so we have concerns about a lot of the mining equipment being concentrated in China. So we know that if we increase the block size to 100 megabytes, chances are the miners in China would not only be concentrated in China, but probably concentrated within at least a single city and maybe within a single data center. And that is a really, really big problem from a security standpoint because Bitcoin is the first AR-15 resistant piece of software, right? Nobody can run up to your door with an AR-15 and make you do anything with it because there's no door to kick in. But if we increase the block size to 100 megabytes, there will be a door, right? Or maybe 3 doors in one city. It'll be very concentrated. And then the system breaks. And like I said before, there's not a whole lot of parameters where you could do that, but the block size with Bitcoin is one of those really critical security parameters. So at the very least, I would say you'd have to be super, super fearful, right? If you were going to mess with that. And so I think not even knowing what that number should be, knowing what I just explained, you would say anybody that's flippant about it should be looked at very skeptically, right? Anybody that gives you, like, for example, a bullshit bullet point, like the market should decide what the block size is, right? That would be like you're about to drive over a bridge and somebody says, don't worry about it. The market is going to decide the thickness of the steel. You're like, whoa. I'm not going for this. Like, I get that economies shouldn't be planned and that government shouldn't plan economies, but you have to be a kind of an evil bastard to take that concept that maybe low IQ people can grok on sort of a very visceral level and then apply that to software architecture. And if we do end up breaking Bitcoin, it's not clear that we would be able to, this could be a one-time thing for this planet, right? It's possible that now that it's so obvious how powerful this stuff is, that the incumbents would attack it early on. Now, I'm not sure about that, but I think it's worth considering the possibility that this is a one-shot deal for us.
Right. And that kind of does annoy me when certain people just kind of play on libertarian free market tendencies and just kind of throw out talking points like that, especially in this space. It's like, I don't, that's all great and all, but like you're saying, there's something a little bit more to it. And so that brings up a question I have, because I hear a lot of people talking about when they're making changes to the code or to the network, that they only really talk about the miners, and they say, well, the miners are providing the service, so the miners should get to make a lot of these decisions. And to me, it kind of leaves out all the individual node operators. Right. Could you talk about the relationship between the miners and the individual nodes and why that environment having some sort of balance there, whatever it is important?
Yeah. And
yes. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, decentralization with nodes, is that important? And if so, why?
Yeah. It's super important. The way that the miners work is they expend electricity, right? They expend a certain amount of cost in order to validate and order transactions. But then they produce these blocks that get sent around, and it really ultimately comes down to the individual users that are running their local software, right? Their node software that determines whether a transaction is in or is out, right? So if we have 50,000 nodes across the planet, and somebody wants to make a malicious change, right? They want to put in an invalid transaction, or they want to do something that is not following the rules of Bitcoin. Those 50,000 nodes are just going to ignore that. And it doesn't matter if the miners, if all the miners got together, 100% of the mining hash power got together, and they tried to put invalid stuff into the Bitcoin network. They tried to put a transaction in that wasn't properly signed, for example. It doesn't matter at all. Every single node would just reject that. and it would be like it never happened. And the nodes would just sit there happily and just wait for the next valid block. And eventually some new miners, presumably would spin up and produce a valid block. So it is important that we have miner decentralization, but node decentralization is also very, very critical. And there was some work that Nick Szabo just did. I think it was in the last 6 months, where he presented some ways to basically balance radio signals off the ionosphere in order to get Bitcoin transactions around the planet. Right? It's in addition to the Blockstream satellite stuff. And if you're sitting in a country that has a Great Firewall of China or a Great Firewall of Great Britain, which is probably even better, it's important to have ways to be able to communicate without that government censorship, right? And if you're using those high frequency radio waves, they can go a long distance and you can get through a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, they're not high bandwidth, right? They're not high throughput sort of signals. And even the satellite stuff, right? Uploading is certainly not a high bandwidth thing. So every time we increase the amount of data that we have to move around the globe in order to keep this network safe and secure, we're reducing options that we have today, but we're also imposing additional constraints on the technologies and the sort of security solutions that we can come up with in the future, like using those high frequency radio waves. So it's not that we shouldn't potentially increase the block size, but we just have to be very, very sober and fearful, frankly, about it. Because it is a critical security parameter, and once it's gone, we don't know if we could ever get it back. As libertarians, a shot at secure money, this is a once in a earth sort of opportunity, right? Gold doesn't freaking work because it's just too easy it's not AR-15 resistant, right? Somebody can show up at your front door and take it. And it's so bulky that it ends up being put in banks, and banks are single points of failure. So they become central banks, and central banks create the slavery that we're all living in. So we really have to be really careful about this. So those are all the downsides, but let's look at the upside, right? So yes, nodes, if we create too much data that needs to be sent around, the cost of the nodes, I forgot to mention this, the cost of the nodes just operating that hardware goes up. Not just their electricity consumption, because that's pretty low, but if it's 100 megabits per 10 minutes, or 100 megabytes every 10 minutes, that's going to be a pretty fat hard drive. And you're going to have a really nice fat internet connection. And you're not going to be able to be some dude on a mountainside with a radio based internet connection, right? So the nodes, the number of nodes is going to go down, and that's going to make the network weaker. Now, if you took that to the extreme, like 100 megabytes, you're probably talking about nodes that are so high performant that they're rack mounted in data centers, right? There's specialized hardware at this point. And then we're back to the kind of the same problem that we have with miners. It's probably, maybe it's 50 data centers around the world you have to kick in the front door of to shut the nodes down, instead of, one or three mining centers. But either way, it's totally bad news, and you don't want that as an outcome.
Yeah, I spooled up a node, I guess a couple months ago, and it took, it's an average laptop I'm doing it on. I'm not really doing anything else on it, but it took, I think, a couple weeks to download the entire blockchain. It takes forever as it is. Yep. Yeah. I can't imagine, doubling, quadrupling, or, anything more than that after a certain period of time. How long? It just wouldn't be worth it. Would you sit there waiting 2 months to load up
and the cheaper, the cheaper that it is, the less data that you have to download, the crappier of an internet connection. It's not just different technologies like, the ionosphere sort of stuff, but it's also, you're just going to have more people participating, right? If it's cheap, if it could get set up in hours, you would certainly have more people doing it than if it has to take weeks. So it's just a serious downside that you'd have to really, really consider. And I think, like I said, if you just get to that point where you realize, wow, this is risky, right? Whatever we do with this thing is risky, then the whole opposition that just sort of is this caricature of engineering looks really, really absurd. And then if you take that a step further and you say, okay, those are all the downsides, that's all the fear, and who knows what would happen, and maybe we can run some tests, and maybe we can get away with 8. Although the analysis that I saw said that 4 was kind of safe, and after that we start seeing some major problems. But let's just say theoretically you thought, well, we might be able to get away with 8, and there's some risk. You'd have to ask yourself, okay, what are the benefits? And if the benefit is going from 7 transactions to 20 transactions per second, when Visa does 7,000 transactions per second, and our goal is to be electronic cash that's global, and so we're talking about 700,000 transactions per second, how in the world are you going to go, all right, this is awesome, we went from 7 to 30, this is a game changer? It's not even a trade-off that you would make if you were just setting up the next WhatsApp, let alone the next, super high security electronic cash system.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like that when Bitcoin kind of shot through the roof last fall, that it was just like, wish it didn't happen, because then we wouldn't even be talking about these issues necessarily, and they'd just be kind of working on stuff without all the other outside pressure. But it is what it is, and
yeah, everyone's
working through it.
Yep.
But I have a question kind of relating to that about fees, because one of the criticisms of Bitcoin, especially several months ago, was the very high transaction fees. And a lot of other coins, they always advertise very cheap transaction fees. But can you talk to the importance of fees and how they relate to network sustainability?
Yeah, so right now, every time a block is found, I think it's 12.5 Bitcoin is the block reward. I think that's right. So when the miners spend a bunch of electricity, let's say they spend $30,000 of electricity in order to find a block. When they find a block, well, I guess globally it would be about 100,000. So they spend about $100,000 in hardware, electricity, whatever, to find a block. Right now, they get about $100,000 in block rewards. A little bit more than that, so it's a little bit profitable. It just depends on your electricity cost, but on average, I think it's a little bit profitable to be a miner right now. And that is going to be what tends to happen on the network, because if the miners get very profitable, then more miners will get installed, and the Bitcoin network will say, okay, I've got more computing power than I had before, so I'm going to increase the difficulty to make sure that I still release a block every 10 minutes. So mining always has a tendency to go to kind of a zero profit, because there's very little barrier to entry, and it's just the way the code's written, is to keep the block reward at the same rate, no matter how much computing power is on the network. But the other thing that the miners get is they get transaction fees. And so if I send you a Bitcoin transaction and it's $10 worth of Bitcoin, I might include 5 cents as a transaction fee. I don't have to, it's optional, but I would tend to probably include something along those lines to encourage the miners to take my transaction off the network and put it into the block. There's nothing that forces the miners to take any transactions. The way that Bitcoin is set up is it's all just about getting everybody to have the right incentives. So instead of relying on like normal kind of software security where there's no bugs or there's no way to guess that password or whatever, most of what happens in Bitcoin is relying on incentives. And so I want to incentivize the miners to take my transaction and include it in a block. And so I'll put a fee in there. And then the network, just the Bitcoin code itself encourages them to mine by giving them the block reward. So it's the combination of both of those things that reward miners for the electricity and the hardware effort that they spend. And that's the way it will continue to be for, I think, about another 2 years. And then the amount of block reward goes down by half. So if I'm right, it's 12.5. It'll go down to, 6.25 Bitcoin per block. And eventually it's going to go down to zero. It's until I think 2140, it continues to half. And then it's basically at zero, or like 1 Satoshi or something by the year 2140. And that's also how we end up with only a maximum number of about 21 million Bitcoin, a little under that. So what Satoshi envisioned is that over time, and the Bitcoin design was that over time, the amount of inflation, the amount of block reward of just newly mined Bitcoins handed to miners goes down every 4 years. It gets cut in half. But we still need the miners to be incentivized to keep running their mining hardware. So the idea is that the mining fees will take over. And that means that the fees would have to go up because right now the fees are not enough. Probably they're, I don't know, maybe they're 5 or 10%. I don't even think they're anywhere near that, but let's say they're 5% of the total reward that a miner gets is from fees. That means that if the mining or if the block reward was 0 today, it's not, but it's headed towards that, right? It's getting cut in half every 4 years. That we would have far less computing power dedicated to securing the network. Because the miners are just going to unplug stuff until it's kind of a break even, at least on profitability. And if we only had 5%, the rewards that we have right now overall between the fees and the mining, we would only have 5% of the kind of computing power and energy that's put into securing the network, which means it would be 20 times easier to attack the network, right? If a bad actor wanted to get involved and double spend transactions or mine empty blocks or do anything malicious to just screw us up, it's going to be, much, much cheaper for him to do that. So the hope is that the transaction fees will actually increase faster than the block reward goes away. And if that happens, the amount of computing power dedicated will always be more and more. Now, as long as the price of Bitcoin is also going up, which it has been, the block rewards, even though the overall amount goes down, the monetary reward is going up, right? So if Bitcoin's worth 100,000 in 4 years, the block reward will still be 6.25 or whatever Bitcoin, but that will be $600,000 instead of $100,000. So the combination between Bitcoin being appreciated, Bitcoin appreciating, and the transaction fees by the year 2140 have to more than compensate for the fact that the block reward completely goes away. So that's one purpose of the fees. The other purpose is like an anti-spam thing, because if it costs absolutely nothing to do a transaction, just the same way it costs absolutely nothing to send you an email, then we're going to have a lot of frivolous or meaningless transactions on the network, and even malicious ones. So that's really what we saw when the transaction fees were really high. So I think 6 months ago or whatever, the transaction fees were getting into the dollar range. It could, if you really wanted to be sure you had a transaction go through, you might have to spend a few dollars for it. And that was because the network was being spam attacked, right? Instead of your email inbox filling up with a bunch of garbage, and there were a lot of miners, or we don't know who, right, for sure, but I highly suspect that the guys that were behind the SegWit 2x and Bcash whole operation were also the ones that were spamming the network. And so they were just sending a lot of transactions basically to themselves to fill up the block space and really exacerbate a problem that wasn't there. And we can see that wasn't, it wasn't really, I mean, it's possible that some of the issue was that Bitcoin was, the Google search terms on Bitcoin were much higher 6 months ago. So it's possible that a big part of the lack of block space, because you can only fit, 7 transactions per second, or now it's 14, I think, something like that, on Bitcoin. And you could argue that some of it was because Bitcoin was just surging in popularity. There was a lot of new entrants into the market, a lot of new people buying Bitcoin. But I think there's been enough analysis done now to where it's pretty obvious also that there was a lot of spam attacks going on at the same time to fill up that block space.
Yeah. And just as a kind of a parallel to this, and you mentioned Visa a few times. Slappy and I have a site, libertymugs.com, where we sell libertarian mugs, and the transaction fees it's people end up with shipping, spend about $20 per mug, and we're paying over $1 for either PayPal or Stripe to process it. So it's pretty expensive there. So it'd be a lot cheaper sending it through Bitcoin.
Yep.
Just to give it a relative.
Right. Totally. And it's not that we don't want the fees to be cheap. It's just that if the fees are cheap, people are going to use it more. That's something that's kind of a basic economic truth, right? If you don't have any tolls on the highway, you can pretty well be sure that you're going to be sitting in traffic. And that doesn't change with the block size. It has to be a scarce resource, just like highway space. Because if we increase it every time we want to increase it, we'll just completely dissolve the security of the system.
Mm-hmm. Slappy, I don't know if you had any more questions in kind of this area. If not, we could.
Let's talk. Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah, let's get into the Lightning Network a little bit. We brought it up before. Can you just kind of go over briefly kind of how the Lightning Network works?
Yeah, totally. And I'm glad that we're talking about it because it is a big part of this whole debate. Because it's not like there was one side that was saying we want to have high transaction fees and we're not willing to compromise the security of the network. And there was another side saying we want to have low transaction fees and we're willing to compromise the security of the network. It was more like we had people that were more than willing to compromise the security for a really stupid way to solve like a short-term problem of dropping the fees in a way that wasn't gonna matter, right? It was, again, back to the Facebook boardroom, right? Like, oh, great, you're gonna cover us for the next 60 days in user growth, and then where are we at? And we did this security compromising operation to pull this off. I think you need to go back to the drawing board. And then you had people that in hand had like a really great design, a really great solution, which was the Lightning Network. And so instead of increasing the block size, the idea behind the Lightning Network is basically creatively delayed Bitcoin transactions. So I can create a Bitcoin transaction and I don't have to broadcast it onto the network. I don't have to put it into the hands of the miners and ask them to include it in a block. I can just create that transaction. And if I delay it sort of in a creative way between you and me, we might be able to get a lot of work done without having to go to the Bitcoin network and put the transaction on the network, which is brilliant because then there's like no fee, right? Or a very, very tiny fee if there's people in between us, and we're going to facilitate sort of the different hops. Yeah, I mean, it's a really brilliant system, but the way that I would describe it at a high level is it's creatively delayed Bitcoin transactions that allow people to do a bunch of transactions, hundreds or thousands between themselves, before they actually have a final settlement transaction that goes on the Bitcoin network. And if it's just between two people, it was called payment channels. The Lightning Network idea is that instead of just you and I being able to do these sort of creatively delayed transactions, we could have somebody in between us, right? And if we can have one person in between us, we can have 5 people in between us, and maybe they're connected to other people. And so we end up creating this big mesh network sort of design where I can not only send money to you, but I can send money through you to somebody else, and somebody else can send money through me to somebody else. All of these transactions don't have to go to the Bitcoin network, but they're actual Bitcoin transactions. They're signed and they're authorized in such a way that if anybody tries to play any games, anybody can kind of pull the fire alarm and immediately go back and just broadcast the transactions to the Bitcoin network, and they will be finalized. And there's nothing that any bad actor can do to stop it. So it's like this brilliant security design. It allows us to scale to 700, 1 million transactions per second, right? It allows us to potentially go where we need to go to be able to support every person on the planet being able to use Bitcoin all the time. And so that was like all designed out, right? Like that before I even got involved. I mean, this stuff is a year at least, really well fleshed out as far as the design goes. There was still code to be written when Bcash, and there's still code to be written now. Lightning Network right now is basically in beta, but it works. I mean, you can pop open your Android phone. You can search for the Eclair wallet. It's a really high quality wallet written in Scala, which is a pretty impressive language. Very, very tends to produce very like secure, really reliable products. You can install that right now, and you can open a Lightning channel and you can send somebody money, and it will be for far less than a penny. So it's not, it's definitely not vaporware. It was obviously not vaporware just the first day that the white paper was published, right? Anybody that is technical could have picked that thing up and just been like, oh my gosh, just like with Bitcoin, it's crazy. This is going to work and it's brilliant. And then it was just a matter of taking the time to really write secure code and test it correctly. And that's pretty close to where we're at now. We've got it in beta and it's working. And, it's really crazy. I mean, I don't know that I would have really gotten very excited about Bitcoin had I found it 2 years ago, because the payment channel stuff just it was clunky to say the least, and the big opposition of blockchains can't scale was pretty legitimate, right? I mean, you could have definitely made that argument, but post Lightning, post that design coming out and really being clear that it worked, it's like, wow, we actually can scale a blockchain to, support everybody on the planet. So, yeah, that's what the guys that were concerned about security were looking at. And they ended up, like I said, increasing the block size from about 1 megabyte to 2, I think, 2.4, something like that. And I really think that was a mistake. It was the way that it was explained to me is that it was a compromise. It was trying to get the guys that ended up doing the SegWit 2x thing and the Bcash guys on board. But I think that was just compromising with con men and wasn't really necessary. We'll see what other innovations like side chains that are also on the table end up coming out within the next couple of years. But even with just Lightning being as functional as it is, like there's no honest debate happening at this point. That's for sure.
That's really interesting. I never heard that they actually did increase the Bitcoin block size, because that's one of the big criticisms is that they say, oh, the Bitcoin, whatever you want to call them, they refuse to have any sort of block size increase.
Yeah. And that's why that's one of the reasons I'm more confident in saying that it's an attack and that these guys are not being honest, because their justifications are dishonest and stupid. Their justifications like, you let the free market decide. Well, how about I let the free market decide, what kind of secure default security parameters you should have on your laptop? No, you're gonna expect that there's going to be engineers involved and that the free market is going to pick the laptop, right? But it's not going to pick that specific security parameter, right? Because consumers are not making those decisions, right? So you can deconstruct their talking points and they get real stupid real fast, which makes it really hard for me to think that they're honest actors. And as far as the block size thing, yes, SegWit was absolutely a doubling of the block size. I think it was a little, maybe it was, I don't know, maybe it was 80% or 120%. I'm not sure, because they changed it from a sort of a generic size to a weight, just to be a little bit more intelligent about the impact a transaction has on the network. But yeah, I believe that most of the Bitcoin blocks, maybe all of them for the past while, have been above 1 megabyte. So they're still saying that, even though you can go to any block explorer and see that there's plenty of transactions above 1 megabyte right now.
So what was SegWit 2x would have doubled that increase?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I believe that's exactly what it was. So that was getting to maybe 8 megs or 4, or maybe it was 4 megs. I'm not sure. I believe the Bcash stuff was 8 megs, but right. Yeah, SegWit 2x was to be double the doubling that was already built into SegWit.
Gotcha.
So it was really like SegWit 4x if they were going to be honest about it.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So I want to talk about ask about one of the criticisms I've heard about the Lightning Network is that, if you want to be a payment channel, you've got to put up a certain amount of Bitcoin to be able to be processed along the network. And I've heard people say, well, the only way that's going to really work out is if you have a couple of these Lightning Network nodes just put up a ton of money, and so it creates this kind of banking effect, and then you just have this centralization, and you're kind of back to what you were trying to get out of with Bitcoin in the first place.
Yeah, it's funny because that's exactly that's exactly what Brian Armstrong at Coinbase asked the Lightning engineers that gave the talk at Coinbase. Like, won't this happen? And their answer was, what market force would cause that to happen? Because the way that the network is designed, you don't care who the node is that you're connecting to. You don't even know what their balance is, right? Like, I have no interest in knowing if I'm trying to send money from me to Rollo and you're in the middle, I have no interest in knowing how much money you have in your channel. I just want to know that my transaction is going to go through. And as a user, it's not like I'm going to make those decisions, right? It's not like we're having this Google Hangouts conversation and I've decided to check on which routers my IP packets are moving through and figure out how much bandwidth they'll support. I don't care about that, right? I expect the software to do that. And of course, that's how Lightning works. It will find a route. It will find a series of hops that will support the transaction that you need to support, but that's all it's going to do. And so if somebody had like $10 million in a channel and there was 50 other people that had $500 in a channel and I'm trying to send you $5, it's very unlikely that I'm not going to know how much they have. I'm not going to have any interest, and it's very unlikely that I'm going to end up using their channel. And the other big factor is that because I don't know who you are, I don't care who you are, I don't need to, because the security assurances are such that it doesn't matter who you are when I route through you. It's going to be very hard for you to charge anything in substantial fees, right? The Lightning Network is designed sort of like Bitcoin, where we want people to open channels and support the network and run Lightning hubs. Hubs is probably a bad term, but run hubs on the network, right, and have multiple channels open so that transactions can be routed through them. So they are able to charge fees. But the big problem when you're trying to charge fees for something that costs you almost nothing, because this is not like mining where there's a lot of electricity involved or a lot of computing power. It's it's basically free to be a hub and facilitate transactions. So how much am I really going to be able to charge in fees? Almost nothing, right? Because the software is automatically going to pick the lowest fee and route through that. So I can't imagine a circumstance, and this is exactly what the Lightning guys said to Brian Armstrong. And this was a year ago, I think. We can include the link to that talk in the show notes page.
Yeah, definitely.
It's like, why would this happen, Brian? Are you crazy? Have you not read the white paper? Do you not know that this system is designed to where it's just completely irrelevant how much you have in a channel as long as you'll facilitate my specific transaction?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I have another question, but I don't want to monopolize. Slappy, do you have something?
Yeah, no, just another thing I heard about Lightning Network, and I don't even know if this is true. And you mentioned when you were talking about Lightning Network that a bad actor couldn't come in and take your money. On another podcast I was listening to, I heard the exact opposite. There's a risk of losing your funds if someone else closes your channel.
Yeah, so a lot of these things have been really dishonestly played up. So the way that it works when we open a channel, which just means that we have funds that are between us that we can send to each other, right? So I put $100 in, you have $100 in. There's $200 in this channel, which is basically just like a multi-sig address, right? That we both have a certain amount of control over. And we're able to transact funds back and forth, right? So we could go like, all right, you start out with $100 and I start out with $100, and now I have 110 and you have 90, and now I have 120 and you have 80. Or I actually decide that I need to send you money, and maybe all of these transactions have nothing to do with you and me because we're just hubs on the network facilitating transactions for other people. But now instead of me having 80 and you having 120, somebody is pushing $50 through, and so now you're going to have 100. Well, I got a little confused there, but let's say you're going to have 150, and now I'm only going to have 50, right? Right. So that process and the ability to do that obviously has to be secure. It would be ridiculous. And I mean, the people, if you look at the people that have been working and backing Lightning and the group of folks that are concerned about raising the block size, you're going to see a lot of like engineers with 30 plus years experience, old cypherpunks like Adam Back that have been working on these problems before anybody even knew that it really existed, right? And these guys are not, they're definitely not idiots. They're not going to end up going, oh yeah, this is a great design, and incidentally anybody can steal your money if they want to. Like,
right.
Come on, it's laughable.
Right.
So there is an issue where if you try to close the channel, right? Let's say that when we first opened it, we each had 100, and now at the end, I'm supposed to have 150 and you're supposed to have 50, right? Which is just the most current transaction, because those creatively delayed sort of Bitcoin transactions, we basically invalidate the previous one. And so you could still have a transaction that shows that you should have 100 and I should have 100, but the more recent one shows that you should only have 50 and I have 150. And if you tried to be a jerk, you could try to broadcast that earlier invalidated one to the network. And that is an issue, but of course that was addressed in the very beginning of the design by saying, okay, if you do that, then I will notice it, right? Because you have to broadcast it out to the network in order to do that. And when I notice that, I have this other transaction that says I get all $200 and you get zero, and I'll broadcast that. And that transaction, I can only broadcast that transaction if I have the data that is in the old transaction. So it's this really interesting, really brilliant set of transactions, because what it effectively means is if we all play nice, everything's good. But if you try to do something greasy, I can take all of your money.
You get all of it.
Right. So
that's a risk.
Exactly. You're going to have to be a real interesting character to want to even attempt that. And the only way that I wouldn't be able to take all of your money for trying to screw me over like that is if for some reason I was offline. Because one of the downsides with Lightning is it requires that you be connected to the internet to send the transactions, to receive the transactions, and also to monitor the network to see if somebody tries to play greasy. But I mean, come on. When was the last time you were using a Bitcoin wallet that wasn't connected to the internet? Like, this is not a solution for your life savings and cold storage under your mattress. This is a solution for the $20 to the cab guy, the $3 coffee. So it's going to be a wallet on your cell phone, and you can do it right now. You can install Async or a Claire by the Async guys. And there's a couple other wallets available also. And you can see that, nobody's going to be able to steal your funds by broadcasting a transaction. And if you try, if somebody tries to do it, your balance is going to go up unexpectedly. So, it's still in beta, right? Don't put $10,000 in your Eclair wallet right now, but it's very, very disingenuous to make it seem like those sort of things were not addressed in the first 5 minutes that these smart guys started whiteboarding out a solution.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question about that criticism of that. Well, you have to be online to use it, but I didn't even think about that.
It is a downside. It is a downside that you have to be online all the time, but it's not a very big downside. And for the use case that it's targeting, which is basically money that's in your wallet, it's a, let me put it this way. It's a much better security risk to say, okay, I'm going to have, a couple $1,000 in my wallet at any point in time, and it's going to be on an internet connected device so that I can get, free transactions, than it is to say, well, we'll just increase the security parameter to a dangerous degree to not even get 10% of the throughput that we could get by doing the Lightning thing.
So if you take your Lightning wallet offline, does that mean it's just you can't do anything with it? So there's no threat of getting funds taken?
Yeah, if you were going to, and some of this stuff is still being worked out. There was actually just an updated paper called L2, EELTOO, I think. It's some creative spelling of L2, like the letter L and then 2, that even addresses some of this stuff. So it's not like these guys are just hanging out, right? Like the guys that are actually technology professionals, and they're cranking and trying to solve this part of the world's problems all the time. They're continuing to advance and fix even some of the criticisms or some of the sort of shortcomings, like having to be online all the time and things like that, right? They're continuing to work on that. So even the downsides that I'm talking about, some of them have already been addressed, and I'm not able to even keep up with the rate of innovation in the space. But But yeah, so if you had money in your Lightning wallet and you opened up a channel for $200, I think the idea is that if you were going to be offline for a long time, you would close the channel. And at that point, you'd have a Bitcoin transaction fee. Mm-hmm. And there was also a concept of these things called watchtowers, and those got a ton of play with the scammers trying to say, "Oh yeah, we don't even have watchtowers designed yet." And the idea of a watchtower is just somebody that would monitor the network on your behalf. So they would see, oh, there's a transaction that's trying to be put on the blockchain that is that's an old transaction, it's an invalid transaction, and so they would immediately go, okay, well. I'm going to broadcast this other thing that punishes that person financially for trying to pull that off. So I don't know exactly what's going on with that. I think that I'm not worried about that if I put $50 in my Lightning wallet, and I'm not really even worried about that if I put a few $100 in my Lightning wallet. And I think that it's not even going to be necessary with the newer designs. But if it was, I think it's not like a critical design flaw in my view, because one of the things that you could do is people could just voluntarily run this code, right? I could just because I'm a nice guy, I could watch the entire network for everybody. So if it was a problem, I would personally just fire one of these things up. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure a lot of other people would too, if they have any interest in the success of Bitcoin. So it's a really, really robust design, right? Like for a security design person to say that it's a really good security design is not something that I would say flippantly, but it's really brilliant. I mean, they have not just like slapped together something stupid here. They really thought through the different ways that this thing could be attacked and the ways to fix it. And it's just the first version, and it's brilliant, right? So it's just going to get better from here. But I think the most important thing to sort of help everybody really grok is that there's no known alternative right now, right? Like the amount of scale that we can get out of Lightning very safely is tens of thousands, if not 1 million plus transactions per second. The only other way that we know how to do that with a blockchain securely, because we can do some stuff with side chains. There's federated side chains that are interesting. But the only way that we know how to do that that's like government hard, right? That's AR-15 resistant is with the Lightning Network. Everything else that's on the table has major downsides. And the worst of those options would be to try to increase the block size to terabytes or whatever crazy numbers would be required to support that kind of scale.
Yeah. You answered my next two questions that I had. So that's good. Slappy, you have anything else?
He's covered everything I wanted to ask.
All right.
Do you have anything else you wanted to add? Did you want to talk about mathbot.com real quick?
Yeah, that'd be great. So for all of the Bitcoin security stuff, check out JWWeatherman.com or to get to the threat model directly and see why increasing the block size is a really bad idea in context of all the things that people could try to do to break Bitcoin. Check out btcthreats.com. But my sort of passion project is something called mathbot.com. And the idea is that kids can learn, and not just kids, but adults also can learn math by programming a robot. So the overall idea is you have problems that you have to solve. You have to have a robot, and you have to code the robot to move around the screen and pick up objects, and pick up a certain number of objects. So if the problem was like 9 divided by 3, you'd have to go take this pile of 9 things and put it in 3 different piles, right? So it's a very sort of hands-on, but through programming way of dealing with math. Yeah, go ahead.
A little more technical than Logo the Turtle?
Actually, I think Logo the Turtle is somewhat similar in the very early stages, but we are going to go all the way through calculus. Ooh. So when you first start playing, there's a grid that's 10 by 20. As the levels go on, that grid gets more and more dense until eventually it's pixel density. So like 1,000 by 1,000 on the screen, and at that point you're programming the robot to basically draw curves for like rocket trajectories and stuff like that. So it starts out really gentle. And right now we've got the first 13 levels up. It takes you through kind of basic programming. And next week or so, we should be able to release the advanced programming levels that'll cover for the computer guys out there. It'll cover conditionals and recursive functions. But yeah, it's pretty. The whole idea behind it is that math and programming are just logic, and it should never be hard. Like if you're ever having a hard time with math, it's simply because you have a bad math teacher, because it should never be more than just the next small step. So we're pretty excited about that. The way that Bitcoin ties into that is that you'll be able to play all the levels for free, but if you have a kid or a grandkid and you want to incentivize them to learn algebra, maybe it's not fun enough on its own, just for the joy of learning algebra and programming this robot. That's the goal. But if it's not quite fun enough, then as a grandparent, you could buy the algebra level, and you would pay with Bitcoin, and then maybe it would be about $50, let's say, for Algebra 1. And we would give the student back $2 or $3 every time they master a level, so that by the time they've finished with Algebra 1, we've given them $45 back in Bitcoin, to be a little bit more carrot and a lot less stick when it comes to math.
That's pretty neat. That's a great idea. I love the alternative ways of teaching.
Cool. Absolutely.
That's
especially cool. I got 3 young kids, so this is I'm thinking about going on there and trying it myself, and then seeing what we can do with these guys.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I'd love the feedback. We've only got maybe a few hundred people that are playing it, and that sounds like a lot, but very few of those people will take the time to send an email when something's broken. That's just how it is. So if you jump on there and give me some feedback, I'd definitely appreciate it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So this stuff will be on our show notes page. It'll be mcflugel.com/90. So we'll have that. We'll have also, you mentioned the talk with the CEO of Coinbase.
Yeah,
we'll have to get that link from you.
Link. Yep, it's the Lightning guys, the folks that designed or wrote the original Lightning white paper, giving a presentation at Coinbase.
Awesome. So JW, we really appreciate you coming on here and explaining this stuff for us.
That was awesome. Learned a ton.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And if you guys have any questions for me, you can hit me up on Twitter at Weatherman I am also.
Thank you. Now I know I'll always leave a note.
Not too many people get that reference.
I know. I love it. All right. Thanks.
I hope you've learned a lesson.
Yeah. If you don't know what we're talking about, go check out Arrested Development.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
I love it.
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us. We'll catch you on Twitter.
All right, man. See you.
Thanks, JW.
Peace. So that was JW Weatherman. That was really entertaining, enlightening. I learned a lot. I don't know about you, Rollo.
Enlightening as in Lightning Network? Is that a pun?
Enlightening Network, yeah. That's where I was going with that.
So, free market success story. So, I don't know if I've ever mentioned it on the podcast before, but it is like an absolute mess of what I have to record all of this. I've got a Chromebook to have the Google Hangout. I've got a little mixer to get everything together, and I was using another laptop that was kind of not the greatest situation in the world. It was getting to be a pain in the butt. It wasn't quite as reliable as what I wanted it to be. So I went online and got a little handheld recorder that has a little flash drive in it, and I just plugged the output of the mixer into it, and it's been awesome. I'm saying that without going back and listening to what we just recorded, so I'm assuming it's going to be awesome. But it's just a little handy thing that, thanks to the market. I mean, think about it. It's what it is. It's a microphone. So you can go out and record stuff, like if you're playing music or want to record a speech or something. It's just a little recorder that does pretty high quality stuff, and it's really not that expensive. So just amazing where we've come come with recording technology in the last century or so.
Well, yeah, and just one of the things about the free market is we had recording technology before this came out.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about a centrally planned economy, they may say we already have the ability to record. Why do you need a handheld little recorder? Well, someone thought it was a good idea, and someone went out there and made it.
Exactly.
It made everything a lot easier.
Yep. So, again, the show notes page is mcflugel.com/90, where, as I said, you'll find links to all the stuff we talked about with JW, as well as ways to follow us on Twitter and Facebook and all the other places we are at, as well as subscribing to our email newsletter. And if you sign up there, we'll give you a discount to libertymugs.com. And also ways to subscribe to us on iTunes and Stitcher for the podcast. And make sure you go on iTunes and Stitcher and leave us a review, which we want to thank Rick Rollin' on Dubs for his wonderful customer review he left on iTunes.
The best possible comment we could probably receive.
He gave us 5 stars. I'm going to read it.
I challenge you to beat it.
Yes. And it has to be, obviously, this is an extremely truthful, honest,
5-star rating.
Yes. So we want you to do the same thing. We want your honest feedback.
As long as it's 5 stars.
So what Rick Rollin' on Dubs wrote is, the best way to listen to this podcast is standing naked in front of a mirror, staring directly at your navel. After a few minutes, you'll be transported to another dimension where your intellectual sensibilities will be massaged into animalistic submission to the anarchy of nature like a 5-star spa for your eardrums.
Thank you, Rick Rollin' on Dubs.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly how I picture people listening to our podcast, so that's how I listen to it when I, listen to it later.
That's how I record it. So.
So, I don't know what to say.
Other than maybe it was Carr after huffing an entire Liberty mug full of glue.
And not having some Yinglings. So, with that, before we ruin a really good episode with stupidity.
Check out the page. Check us out on Twitter.
Yep. And we'll catch
at Rollo McFlugel.
We'll catch you next week.
Peace.